So g'day. You all hear me okay? Yeah? Look, this is a really tough gig coming on after the Minister and Ray Avery. I mean, it's sort of like starring in a movie with children or dogs, you know, really cute children or dogs. But the really good news is that this afternoon, particularly after lunch, your gamma waves are really very active, which kind of means that although your rational part of your brain is a little tired at the moment, you're actually really open to making new connections, very different connections. This is really the best time of the day to be doing creative work. So I'm hoping that we can talk about some slightly different approaches to the whole area of strategy in an uncertain environment. So just so we get some things out of the way, my accent, some of you might have been worrying about. So I was originally born in South Africa. I've actually lived outside of the country for many, many years. I lived in the UK, and I've just clocked up 29 years in Australia. I've got a Scottish partner, so it's kind of crazy at home, but that's where I come from. I'm trained as a classical economist. I'm sorry. I know I have a lot to answer for. But I guess over the years, what we've begun to understand is that a lot of the classical sort of lessons and tools of economics are really becoming less and less valid. A number of years ago, a winner of the Nobel Prize in Economics was a fellow by the name of Daniel Kahneman. Some of you might have heard of Daniel. Now that's not a significant event in itself, other than the fact that he was a psychologist. And so in a sense, what we've begun to understand is that human beings are predictably irrational. And that's a very different way of looking at the world. And I think looking at strategy in an uncertain environment is really all about that. So what are we going to talk about today? We're going to talk about a few things. We're going to talk about the fact that uncertainty really changes everything. It actually presents a whole new set of challenges for us, for our brain, the way we think and the way we operate. We're going to talk about the fact that the complexity in our environment is really what drives the uncertainty. And because of that, we're going to really discuss the fact that planning for the future is really very different, because it's no longer about what's going to happen or what we're going to do. It's about saying, what are the capabilities we might need when we face alternative futures? So I guess the whole thing about resilience that we've been discussing and as part of the national strategy is actually about building capabilities across a wide range of futures. Now, I know many of you are across this already. You're doing it in your work. But one of the things we'll talk about is the distinction between planning and strategy. They're really very different animals. They work very differently. They need to work together, but they need to be done in very different ways. So let's just examine why uncertainty changes everything. I think the first thing you know is that in an uncertain environment where things are changing and things are unpredictable, it's very hard to predict the future. And the reason that it's very hard to predict the future is that at any point in time, we don't just face one future. We face a variety of futures. We talk about alternative futures, or we talk about scenarios. But the whole idea of actually facing alternative futures is quite a difficult thing to get your head around. And one of the things that we will see is that the mere fact that we are actors in this world, in this community, in this society, is really what is shaping those alternative futures. So a lot of the things we do and the decisions we make on a day-to-day basis will actually have an influence on the way the future plays out. So please, when people talk about future studies, we're not saying we're trying to predict the future. And I often say there really is no future in trying to predict the future, because our predictions are frequently wrong. Instead, what we need to do is consider the fact that any form of strategy into the future has got to embrace uncertainty, and that uncertainty implies that we really have a range of futures that we need to deal with. So let's examine very quickly the challenge that uncertainty and complexity and uncertainty really give to us. You've all seen diagrams like this. You've seen slides which talk about the new economy and the different rules and the attitudes in society. You've all seen this sweeping wave of conservatism, which kind of, you know, sort of is really reshaping the world order. You've understood things about the environment, and indeed a lot of the stuff that we talk about here about the impacts of the environment. And of course, we've all heard about technology and its convergence. And all of those things are really kind of having a tremendous impact on ourselves and our organizations. Now, one of the things that economics has given me is a good sense of economic history. This is a piece of work done many years ago by a Russian economist, Alexander Kondratiev. His philosophy is very simple. His thesis is very simple, and that is that Well, the different waves of technology that we've actually seen embrace the world in those phases, each wave of technology has brought about a different mode of communication. And what that has resulted in, so if you kind of think about, the spinning wheel or the cotton mill and the canals and so on, then our mode of communication was in fact around rivers and canals and very sort of simple one-to-one. The advent of the Industrial Revolution, of course, rail and steel and steam, giving way to the automotive or engineering era, and then prior to the Second World War, just after the Second World War, the whole automotive industry and, motor highways and aircraft and so on, and of course the biotechnology phase, and now we're of course in a period known as the sixth wave, and we're still trying to define what that really means. But the thing that's really significant about that is the fact that the mode of communication between individuals has really changed, largely enabled by, these things. And what mobile technology and mobile communication devices have meant is that if you look at any system, the nodes within the system are intelligent. It's actually one of the reasons that economic theory doesn't work, as the classical economists predicted. Because every time information passes from one node to another, each node interprets it through their own frame of reference, gives it meaning, and passes that message on. So as the information spreads through the society, through the community, through the organization or institution, the meaning evolves. And so it's given rise to what we know as complex systems, complex adaptive systems. And they have rather unique and special qualities. And it's because of those qualities that we face the uncertainty that we face today in our environment, in civil defense, in organizations, in markets, in international relations. So what I'm going to do is, rather than kind of try to explain in technical terms what a complex adaptive system is like, I'm going to show you a very short video. It's only about 30 seconds. Some of you might have seen this, but it's an experiment that took place in Kuala Lumpur in a laboratory. And in that laboratory, you'll see a young research student. He has 5 metronomes on the table, each one set to a different amplitude. Remember the old metronome when you learn to play the piano? It goes tick, tock, tick, tock. It kind of, I still have nightmares about it, and it's probably why I never learned to play the piano. But the interesting thing about it is when he starts the 5 metronomes off, it's a very discordant sound because none of them are actually in sync with each other. He's got them on a plank, which he then lifts up and puts them on 2 they're not beer cans because it's Malaysia, they're Coca-Cola cans. And something really interesting happens, which is kind of interesting. It doesn't sound real good. And so on and so on. Okay, you can do that in your own backyard under adult supervision. But I'm going to ask you a quick question, and maybe you could just turn to your person sitting alongside you and just ask yourself, what's that actually got to do with complexity, and what's going on in that very simple experiment? I know this is not a workshop where we have an intimate group of people where we can all talk, but maybe just exchange a few views in your post-lunch stupor and see if we can... I know it's really hard. When the blood sugar levels drop, there's absolutely nothing you can do about it. I know, you just got to laugh. But what's really going on here? What's going on there, and why does that happen, do you think? Okay. Alrighty, I didn't mean so long and so loud. Okay. I got it. So, is there any brave soul in the audience who's happy to put their hand up and shout out real loud what they think is actually happening there? Could we just hear from somebody? Anyone? Anyone like to just suggest A, what's going on, and B, what it has to do with complexity? There's self-organisation, is absolutely right, but what's enabled that self-organisation? It's the connection between them. So if any of you, and I'm sure there are a number of engineers here, understand about Newtonian physics, then every action has an equal and opposite reaction. But that communication, the shift in energy and the sharing of that shift in energy is obviously enabled by the moving plank, fair enough. And I'm using a bit of poetic license. But it actually illustrates one of the really important principles of complex adaptive systems. And that is that a complex adaptive system, any complex adaptive system where there is connection and intelligence in the nodes, starts off as a series of lower level interactions. So each individual metronome is just kind of doing its own thing at its own amplitude. And as a result of the communication, that develops into a series of higher level capabilities which ultimately allows for the adaptation of that system. So in a sense, this is really what innovation is about. It's about allowing the different parts in the network to be communicating, but to recognize that as a result of that, the system actually changes. Now, one of the things we'll see is that sometimes the changes that occur are unintended. Sometimes the consequences are unintended, which is why you can't actually predict with any level of accuracy what's going to happen in an innovation exercise, nor can you predict with any level of accuracy or certainty about what's going to happen in the future if we're dealing with a complex environment like our natural environment that we're in. Now, most of planning starts off with a set of base assumptions. So we assume the levels of migration to urban centers. We assume the interest rate. We assume the growth rate of GDP. We assume exchange rates. And of course, as soon as the plan goes live, those assumptions a few months later are proved wrong. And as a consequence of that, our whole plan sort of falls over in a heap. So we've actually got to start looking at the planning process in the future in a very different way. And I know that many of you know this, but it's just kind of useful to spend a little bit of time understanding the construct of complexity and trying to understand the distinction between a simple, complicated, and complex system. So I know this is really kind of technical and hazy and after lunch, but I want to talk to you about the simple relationship that exists between cause and effect. In a simple environment, we have this very simple linear relationship where cause equals effect. So an example of a simple system is a light switch in a room. You go to the light switch, you switch it down, the light goes on. If you switch it again, the light goes off. That's simple. And in that environment, you can use best practice. So even a poor Australian Sparky can come to New Zealand, and if he can get a job, or she can get a job, they can actually wire a simple light switch because there is best practice and we know how to do it. When you move into the complicated space, you start seeing that cause only approximates effect. So I don't know about you, but most of you probably travel quite a lot. You fly into new cities, into strange hotels, and you might arrive in a hotel room at 11:30 at night. You're pretty tired. It's been a hard day. You just want to get to bed. Put your pajamas on, brush your teeth, and now you want to turn the light off. So you walk over to the bed, and there's this massive bank of light switches, yeah? You hit the first one, the bloody curtains open. The second one turns the TV on. The third one calls the butler or whatever the hell, depending on where you're staying. And eventually you realize it's usually the switch furthest away from the bed that switches the light off. So it's one of the habits I've cultivated, and it's a kind of good practice. It doesn't always work, but at least there's an approximate relationship. Now, when you move into the whole realm of a complex system, which is the space we're in New Zealand, when we deal with this environment and the kinds of issues and risks that are involved in civil defense and emergency management, you get into this notion of complexity, and here what you find is that cause has multiple effects. So you go back to the office day after tomorrow, and you've got this report to write for the minister, or you've got a report to write or a project to complete, and you switch on your computer, and you get this amazing blue screen. You think, oh shit, the operating system hasn't come up. What am I going to do now? So because you're a good corporate citizen, you ring the help desk, and you say, switch to my computer, the operating system didn't boot, what do I do now? And what do they tell you most of the time? Turn it off and turn it on again. That's exactly how a complex system works. Some of you involved in aviation will know that very few aircraft ever travel or ever fly or ever pronounced airworthy with 100% of their systems working. It's just impossible. In fact, our previous head of the Civil Aviation Authority, his name may not be all that good here because his name was Dick Smith, and of course the whole Dick Smith thing collapsed. But he was the head of civil aviation. He once made a very politically unwise but accurate statement. He said, what Australia needs is affordable air safety. okay? Now, what affordable air safety really means is that we've got to recognize the logarithmic kind of movement of that cost curve as we try to get to 100% reliability or predictability in any complex system. It just can't be done. Or if it were done, none of us really, or very few of us, would really be able to afford to fly. So there's that kind of sense then that you have to accept the unpredictability and the uncertainty. But here's the rub. The real rub is that as you cross that chasm into a complex system, best practice no longer works. So the mistake that a lot of leaders make is that they will take a practice that might have been effective in a previous job or a previous organization, or perhaps lift out a seeming best practice from one organization in another system altogether and implant it in their own organization, and then wonder why all these unintended consequences occur and all this uncertainty. So you fix this and then all of a sudden that goes wrong. So the kind of strategy there is really to recognize this notion of emergent strategy. And that's what we saw with the metronomes, that something emerges from the system, but it only emerges if you're looking for it, if you understand it, and if you study the system as a whole. So I think this is a really important part, and this is one of the factors then that starts shaping the way we think about strategy in the future, in an uncertain future, and the way we plan for it. Incidentally, the best example of a complex system we know, complex adaptive system we know, is the human brain. And so by studying the human brain, there's been a lot of learnings about strategy and the way we think about strategy. Then, of course, if we descend into chaos, we know that there's almost no relationship between cause and effect. And we've simply got to get out there and do things and see what happens. So in a sense, in a chaotic environment, we've actually just got to try novel and new things and see what kind of happens. So very simply then, baking a cake, even I can do it. You follow a recipe, the cake turns out. Building a rocket, a bit more complicated, but you can actually, generally get it right if you follow the rules. But anyone who's ever raised a child will know that. I mean, I've got three. I've got 2 girls and a boy. And I swear we've raised them all the same way, but my God, the difference between one and the other, is really just phenomenal, because complex systems just behave in different ways. So very quickly then, to finish off our discussion on complexity, complex adaptive systems have 4 key elements that really need to be understood. And we need to understand our whole sector, our whole system within the sector as a complex system, because you've got intelligent nodes. Whichever part of the sector you're involved in, your node is intelligent, both inside it and between the various components. So the first thing we need to understand is that the notion of the butterfly effect really influences the way a complex system behaves. So a butterfly lands on a tree in Chile, and 3 days later we have a tropical storm in far north Queensland. And so everything, one thing affects another, affects another, affects another. So all the parts are connected. The second part, which is system integrity, is really the old 1 + 1 = 3. Some of which you may understand as the whole is more than the sum of its parts. You've all heard that term. Now, there's a very interesting point about the whole is more than sum of its parts. And that is that concept was originally taken from the psychology practice called Gestalt. It's a German term. But we actually misinterpreted the meaning of the word Gestalt. It doesn't mean the whole is more than the sum of its parts. It means the whole is different to the sum of its parts. So the overall system has different properties to the various elements. And it's that combination of capabilities that we're looking for in a devolved system such as yours. It's also subject to unpredictable and emergent behavior, which we know. So we can't always predict the outcome of different events. We can't always predict the outcome of different activities. And finally, the one that's really beginning to exercise our mind in our research is the concept of brittleness. Now, one of the things we know about complex systems is that as the system becomes more connected, more communication enabled, eventually a few hubs start appearing, which are more connected than any other. And those hubs really become quite important drivers of the system. Now, as soon as that occurs, you get what's known as a build-up in the momentum of the system. Now, that momentum, in some cases, is associated with positive outcomes, but in other instances is associated with negative incomes and negative outcomes. But the important characteristic about momentum is that it starts overtaking the natural checks and balances that might otherwise occur in the complex system. And in complex adaptive systems theory, we know that that leads to systems breakdown. So we translate that to organizations and organizational systems like yours. Centralization potentially can speed it up, but it can actually damage the system. It's one of the theories that has been very successfully applied, for example, to the global financial crisis, when the trading of derivatives, which are actually thousands and thousands and thousands of products all packaged together. It's kind of like this big cog driving lots of little cogs. A small movement in a derivative has massive impacts all the way through the system, and that leads to system breakdown. So that's got some really important implications for the way we think about our sector and where we think about our organizations in the sector. So let's examine the impact of this complexity on organizations. The first thing is that we have to find a way of limiting the use of what we call a reductionist approach. Now, reductionist approaches are used in universities, at schools of management, because what we do is we teach marketing, we teach operations, we teach finance, we teach human resources. And we kind of figure that if we teach each of those, or if you develop each of those, you know, we can actually improve the overall system. We can't. You cannot improve the overall system by simply focusing on the individual components. You have to view the system as an integrated whole. So in a way, you know, when we talk about the fact that it's devolved, it needs to be devolved to respond at the grassroots level, but it also needs some coordination at the top. So you've all heard about optimization. How do you optimize a system? Meaning, how do you make sure that the right level of resources are in the right place at the right time? Well, optimization mathematically is a top-down approach. It's not a bottom-up approach. You cannot optimize a system by simply improving the component parts. You've actually got to take a view from the top. So there's a role, if you like, for both top-down views and overall kind of thinking about strategy, and also bottom-up development. And neither should actually dominate the other. We can't rely on best practice, we can't rely on best practice because everything is connected, and we've already discussed that already. You need to develop unique, I was listening to Ray Avery this morning. It's kind of hard not to wish you were a Kiwi sometimes, at least he didn't say too many derogatory things about Australia. But I think a lot of what he said is absolutely true. You're not fond of rules, you dare to dream, and you know, you get away with stuff that other people wouldn't. Because you just don't think that things are impossible. And I think that's absolutely wonderful. And as a result, you kind of invent and create yourselves. And I think that's really important because you understand your system better than anyone else. And actually, it's by studying the system, by what he called observation of your own system, that practice emerges that then becomes your best practice. But don't let Canada come and copy what you do because it will not work in their environment. Uncertainty generally promotes stress and knee-jerks, and so one of the things we need to do is to understand that when any organization is under stress, there's a part of the human brain which stops working. Stress shuts down your prefrontal cortex and promotes limbic activity. So limbic activity is that space which is not entirely filled by, but is dominated by your amygdala. And that generally has a massive effect on the way we operate. So any individual under stress finds that a number of things change for them. And it happens in an organization. Your peripheral vision narrows. You stop looking for solutions and you only focus on problems. You become very defensive. Your repertoire of behaviors are reduced. You're unable to think of new alternative ways of solving this problem. And you go back to that which you know and that which has worked in the past. And we've studied organizations in stress and found that all of a sudden the range of things that they try actually get reduced. So while it's important to recognize that times of trouble do promote different ways of doing things and innovation, the best time to really think of new and different things is now, when you're on top of things. And finally, I think the point about centralization, it needs to be used very sparingly, because we know that centralization creates concentration and connectivity around a few hubs, greater momentum, more brittleness, and potential system breakdown. So I think one of the things you need to guard against very carefully is in fact over-centralizing the system, but actually also ensure that you do enough coordination. So I'm just going to ask you a quick question. And that question, again, perhaps you might just turn to your neighbour and ask them and ask yourself. So what's the impact been of complexity and uncertainty in your part of this whole sector, in your little business, in your particular unit? Just talk for a few seconds about that and try to think about how has this notion of unpredictable, kind of uncertain environment really affected you in your business? Yeah. Okay. All righty. So perhaps one or two of you might be kind enough to share some of your thoughts with the rest of us. I know it's a bit difficult to always be heard, but anyone prepared to share some of their views about how complexity, the resultant uncertainty, and of course the relationship is complex systems are uncertain and it's the uncertainty that produces the risk. So risk is just a natural consequence of being in a complex environment. And one of the things we know is that you can never really reduce the risk. All you can do is learn to manage it. It's one of the things we teach in neuroscience that you can't actually reduce the stress or the risk. You can only learn to manage it. Yeah, you were going to share something. Wow, okay. Did everyone hear that? Would you mind just standing up and repeating that and perhaps just projecting your voice that way? That'd be helpful. Thank you.
How much of the fire service's business and engagement, I suppose I better start at the beginning.
Okay. I think we got it.
Okay. I'm with the fire service and I've only been there a limited period of time. And what I have noticed is because of the impact of both prior and occurring change, that there is what I would call something of a disconnect between where the focus of operational managers and commanders lies, as opposed to what I see as an analyst when I sit back and look and see what the trending statistics about what their business is. And it is quite significant. There is still a very high, and understandably so, they're called the fire service, around fire and fire impacts. But already there are substantial areas of the country where 50% of the business is rescues and medical call-outs, not fire.
Yeah, no, that's very useful. In fact, one of the things that often occurs is this kind of drift, and particularly in situations of stress and uncertainty, you tend to go back to that which you know and that which you've done and that which has worked before. So that's really telling. So I'm sure you've all got your own sort of versions of that story and how it kind of impacts on you. But uncertainty and complexity, uncertainty and risk has had a tremendous effect on the way that organisations have operated and how they're having to think about their operations. So thank you for sharing. So I thought what we might do now, halfway through, is to kind of shift our attention to, how we might go about future strategy, setting, developing, crafting, implementing strategy in the future in an uncertain environment driven by complexity and which gives rise to risk. The first thing I need to be very clear about is that future strategy is not about predicting the future. It's about saying, what are the range of capabilities that we would require? So if we go back to that earlier diagram we looked at, we know that strategy in uncertain times is about recognizing that you face alternative futures, multiple futures. And that for each future, there is a set of capabilities which are required in order to thrive, in order to be effective. And one way of really understanding resilience is to recognize that resilience is just the capability to operate across a wider set of contingencies. And that's pretty much the best we can do. That's pretty much the best we can do. I mean, I met a NASA officer, a retired NASA officer, a year ago, and he was saying that for years and years what they were doing is training astronauts about how they might survive on the dark side of the moon, because no one really knew much about the dark side of the moon. I don't know how many of you have seen the movie Martian, The Martian. Anyone seen the movie? Yeah, it's about the astronaut who gets stranded on Mars and just the incredible ingenuity and adaptation which Matt Damon goes through to kind of firstly reconnect communication-wise with Earth and then how they get him back. And so that's really what resilience is. If you think about resilience in a physical sense, resilience is simply giving you the physical ability to cope under a wide range of physical conditions. Mental resilience is the ability to think through a wide range of problems. Emotional resilience is the ability to withstand an enormous range of things that you're exposed to. And spiritual resilience is the ability to hold on to that which you really believe, no matter how much around you is going wrong. So this whole notion of resilience that you're working on is intimately tied to this different way of thinking about the future. National resilience is ultimately tied and intimately tied to recognizing that you face a variety of futures. So in our research, we've identified what we call the signposts to resilience. And 4 of these I'm sure you're very familiar with. The 5th one is what I'm hoping to share some insight with you on. So the first thing that we know that drives resilience, the old meerkat, is situational awareness. And situational awareness is clearly developed as a result of scanning your environment, which I know you do very regularly in very different ways. All these sensors that you have, people like you, Cowan, at EQC. Is you here over today at all? Where is you? No, he's not here. He'll talk to you about that and the kind of network that had been set up to really detect movements in the ocean and temperature. And these are really warnings of kind of the environment and how it's kind of changing and what that might result in. Organizational agility. Well, organizational agility is the capability you have to be doing multiple things at once and having a very strong networked approach to civil defense is an intimate and integral part of how you achieve that. So your network is actually the strongest thing you have going. And the fact that your network is made up of diverse range of capability. I see people in uniform, I see people in jeans, I see people in suits. Clearly you all come from different parts of the civil defense world. Now, you know, I'm an economist, so I've got a very simple take on diversity. And I know it's wrong politically to say, well, diversity's got nothing to do with political correctness. And I know there's an argument which says, you know, if you live in an environment and there's a multiple range of people in that environment from different backgrounds, then you need to make your organizations representative. Yeah, I get that. But for me, that's not the driving reason for diversity. For me, I go right back to biology, and I look at things like populations. And we know from our history that the populations that survive and thrive are those that have the greatest genetic diversity in their gene pool. So genetic diversity, diversity in your gene pool is critical. The whole process of natural selection, the whole ability to kind of think differently about the same phenomenon is critical. And that's really what this whole concept of your network really represents. The fact that you are talking to each other, that you're bringing so many diverse points of view together is something to be truly treasured. I mean, spent some time in the US and I witnessed a kind of a major kind of argument between, you know, different parts of the civil defense network, and I don't want to mention who they are, but they're at war with each other. So I think that, you know, your ability to communicate and network is so critical. Having a clear purpose, and I think there's a lot of stuff that's going to come out of your branding exercise, and I think the really interesting thing to recognize in your messaging is a basic neuroscience concept, and that is towards messages are far more powerful than away messages. So away messages are things like, if we don't do this, we'll be roadkill. If we don't do this, we'll never survive. Those are away messages. Danger does promote initial action, but it does so in a very narrow way, because danger promotes stress. The brain hates danger. The brain is designed to keep us safe, and as soon as you put the brain in a safe space, it will be creative. So towards messages are things that really present an alternative and compelling and desirable future. So I'm hoping some of that comes out in the discussion on branding. And then, of course, something you all know about is strong governance. One of the things our research has shown is, again, the diversity of the board is actually more important than the individual skills board members might have in that sector or space. Because they're the ones that ask this dumb questions. They're like consultants. You know, except they get paid. But, you know, they ask dumb questions, and it's often those dumb questions or questions which are based not on an understanding of the industry that really promote the kind of real overseeing function. But the one we want to really talk about is how we might study the future and how we might use scenario planning, because that's a critical tool in the whole area of planning for the future. So I'd like to just spend a bit more time looking at strategy as the whole issue of studying the future. So we'll look at strategy in an uncertain environment and just kind of see what that's about. I'm going to do three. I'm going to just firstly have a look at the 5 key principles of strategy in uncertain environments. Then I'm going to show you a case study, a hypothetical example of how that might occur in this amazing kind of trick that you've played on the world, which is, despite your demographics, you've won the World Cup twice. And I'm going to just use a rugby analogy to kind of explain how, you know, poor Michael Checker is trying to deal with this in the pending 2019 World Cup. And then I'm going to show you a case study of how we use this in a, you know, not a dissimilar industry, just give you a sense of how this might work. So there are 5 key principles of scenario planning or strategy and uncertainty. The first is that we need to recognize that the future doesn't exist waiting for us to encounter it. The future doesn't exist a priori. It isn't there waiting for us to come into it. So I don't wish to challenge any religious beliefs that some of you might have, or cultural beliefs, you know, your karma and your destiny and all that sort of stuff. But as an economist and as a scientist, I know that this future doesn't exist. The future is not predetermined. You know, and some cultures actually don't recognize the distinctions that we make between the past, the present, and the future, as if they're 3 different things. Confucian cultures generally accept that, you know, there's a continuum. I remember my brother's an anaesthetist. He's kind of in the same business. He just uses chemicals, you know. But anyway, so when he was a first-year medical student, he walked around in his white coat with his stethoscope. He was actually being a doctor. So it's kind of interesting description of the continuum. But the future is not predetermined. It's actually not waiting for us to happen. In fact, the future is a set of possibilities. So there's an interesting diagram which doesn't mean very much. So I'll tell you a quick story. When we moved up from Melbourne to Sydney some years ago, my eldest daughter, who was very young at the time, was fascinated by the concept of the traffic along the Pacific Highway. We lived on the North Shore, and we'd go up to the milk bar on a Sunday to buy the newsagent. And she'd say, Daddy, look at the traffic. I say, yep, Marissa, that's the traffic. And she'd say, oh, the traffic's amazing. And there's all this energy and sound of cars and trucks and motorcycles, buzzing past, and just, it felt really vibrant and alive. Then one morning we're driving along in the old Holden, heading south down the Pacific Highway, dropping her off at kindy, and she sat in the back seat, in the baby seat, and she says, Daddy, we are the traffic. And I'm thinking, that's kind of huge, she's recognized that in time period 1, she's looking at something as an external objective phenomenon, and in time period 2, she is that phenomenon. She's actually part of it. And so it occurred to me that imagine if the old Holden had broken down at the intersection between Boundary Road and Pacific Highway. Very busy. 7:20 Monday morning, one of the biggest arterials in Australia, in Sydney. And the old car packed up, and there we are, and I grabbed my cell phone, one of those big ones in those days, and I called the NRMA, the AA, and I said, hey, my car's broken down, can you get here? And 20 minutes later, they get there, and they repair the alternator or the battery or whatever the hell's going on there. And I get the car going, and I turn up Boundary, and I drop her off at kindy. And after I've kissed her and waved her goodbye, I turn on the radio to listen to the traffic report. And the traffic report says, beware of the intersection between Boundary and Pacific Highway. There's been a breakdown. There's a massive build-up of traffic. And I'd say, good thinking. You know what? I'll take another way to work this morning. So what happens, of course, is that in time period 1, there's an action. Yeah? My car breaks down. It's an action. In time period 2, I discover the effects of that action, and then I make a choice about what I'm going to do and act again. So all of us are players, are actors in this creation of the future. And so what we do actually now is not just respond to the environment, but actually help to shape and create it. And that's a very empowering and powerful kind of way of thinking about strategy and the future. Thirdly, any approach to strategy should embrace uncertainty. We cannot pretend we live in this linear environment where everything can be predicted. So any approach we take has got to embrace and encompass this notion of alternative futures. So we need to recognize that. And one of the things about planning in alternative futures is that we have to recognize that it's better to be vaguely right than completely wrong. So those of you who have some time later on, you might want to Google Redfox in Yellowstone Park. And it's this wonderful series of videos. You've seen that video? Yeah. So it's this red fox in the middle of winter, and he's hungry. She's hungry. And they know in this part of Yellowstone Park, which is snow-covered, that there are field mice somewhere in the vicinity, but they don't know where. But they're hungry. So, they creep along very carefully, and they listen. And then they suddenly dive down a hole head first. And they come up with nothing. And they come out and they do the same thing. They creep very carefully, and then they dive down a hole. After about the 3rd or 4th time, they come up with a field mouse, and that's dinner. So they know that the field mouse is in that space, and that's good enough. But they have no idea exactly which hole it is down. And that's just one of the things we have to accept, that it's better to be vaguely right than completely wrong. And finally, I think what we need to do is to recognize that in any environment, we have a range of futures. And the more diverse those futures are, the better our chances of coming up with a resilient outcome. It's kind of like practicing with lead in your boots. And then on the weekend when you play your big game, you take the lead out of your boots and you kind of feel light because you're prepared for a worse set of conditions than actually occurred. And the more diverse the portfolio, the more diverse the scenarios, the better the chance you have of developing the capabilities that are really required. So here's the learning part of the exercise. I know this is something you have some vague interest in. The Rugby World Cup. Let me paint a hypothetical story of how Michael Checker might use scenario planning to prepare the poor Wallabies in their defence. No, you don't talk about the defence of the last World Cup. In our attempt to win the World Cup for the 3rd time. Okay. So he's got a dilemma at any point in time. And his dilemma is he doesn't really know what is the dominant or what will be the dominant style that the competition will be playing. And therefore, what he has to respond to. What's the kind of conditions of the game? Is it going to be a very fast and mobile game? In which case he needs to get lots of athletic people and players who can move quickly around the field? Or is it going to be a very slow and strong game and sort of recruit from South Africa, you know, where the blokes have got like heads that come straight out of their shoulders, no necks at all, you know? And really it's all about power. Or is it going to be a very kicking and tactical game, in which case we need to start borrowing from Aussie rules to get people with great ball skills and kind of athletic ability? So that's a dilemma because, you know, what should he do? He doesn't really know what to do. So he has three options. One is he can predict the future. Take a bet on one particular future and then find he shows up at, it's going to be in Japan, isn't it? Shows up in Japan with a team that's ill-prepared to play the kind of rugby that has evolved and emerged. And, you know, the New Zealanders, the All Blacks are playing a completely different game and they run us off the park. That's not a terribly good thing. Or you can, as the South Africans did a number of years ago, he can lobby the International Rugby Union, get them to change the rules of the game that suit the way he wants to play it. Sometimes that works, but I'm not sure who you're going to lobby in this instance. And his third option is he can build and focus on building capability for the future. So how does he do that? Well, he says, imagine if each of those games that emerged were an alternative future. What would the capabilities be that I'd need to operate effectively in that environment? Now, an interesting thing about scenario planning and planning for the future is you turn the discussion around. I've had this discussion with a number of agencies. We did some work with MPI on the future of biodiversity in New Zealand. And it's not about predicting what the hell is going to be happening in 10 years' time, because generally that's where these discussions break down. You know, in my opinion, this is going to happen. No, you're wrong. In my opinion, that's going to happen. And you get caught in this logjam. And so what future strategy or scenario planning does is it turns the exercise on its head and it says, let's not argue about what we think is going to happen. Let's instead ask ourselves, what would we do if each of those futures did occur? And now you can actually do some serious thinking about it. Because now you say, well, what's the winning strategy under those three scenarios and what capabilities do we require? And you then backcast, which is say, well, if that's all we'll need in 2019, what do we need to do today? Now, here's a phenomenon that I'm still marveling at. And in 15 years of doing scenario planning, it's still amazing how this works. And that is that you'll find that sometimes as much as 40% of those capabilities are common. If they're common across a diverse set of scenarios, and obviously the more diverse the better, then it's a no-brainer. You start building those capabilities now, because those are no-regret bets. They are bets that you can actually make with a reasonable level of comfort that they are going to play out, and your capabilities that you build will be relevant. And then as you move forward, so you begin to refine and you recognize the critical path that you might be on. So I'll show you one other example of scenario planning. We did this in the Department of Health. And their question to us was, we need to kind of put in place a 15-year investment strategy. But the way we invest our funds in public health really depends on the kind of environment and what people's attitudes are, what the government believes about public health, how much funding we're going to get and so on. So we said, okay, well, the whole idea is scenario planning, as you probably know, is based on the key uncertainties in your environment that have the biggest impact on the way that environment unfolds. And we identified two of those. The first was a kind of a quasi-political agenda, which was to say, would the government of the day have high social engineering kind of philosophies, a Labor government, for example, a left-leaning government, where there'd be a strong political agenda about health and well-being. They'd have incentives and sanctions. I mean, as you know, the cigarette packaging policy at the moment we've got is a sort of a legacy of that view. In Australia, you know about the fact that you can't buy cigarettes. They're not on display and they're in plain package wrapping and all that sort of stuff. But they would actually sanction and penalise firms that had very high sugar content and high sodium content in their food. And there'd be a lot of stuff like no McDonald's within 10 kilometres of the nearest school and stuff like that. And there'd be a strong advocacy. In fact, I was chatting to your Norm about our Norm. They had a wonderful campaign some years ago called Life Be In It. And it was all about promoting people's become active. And the key kind of character was this sort of person called Norm. And Norm was a couch potato, and he just kind of sat on the couch and, exercised his thumb on, the TV control and just drank beer and ate chips all day. And, so Norm has those connotations for me. Sorry, Norm, but there you go. Or a low social engineering government, which is really effectively a conservative government, wasn't a priority, tax and incentive neutral, didn't mind about advertising and comms. And the other dimension was the concern that the public themselves had about their own well-being and health. So on the left-hand side, you get this low concern, people are apathetic, low uptake of sport, the couch potato phenomenon, the Churchill effect, you know that one. If it's good enough for Winston, he lived till he was 90-something, he drank a bottle of whiskey a day and smoked 200 cigarettes a week or something. If he can do it, so can I, no problem. On the other side, the fact that concern for health and healthy living and so on. And so we constructed these 4 scenarios where we had the nanny state, top left-hand corner, where the government will look after you because you don't know how to do it. We had this low social engineering, but this kind of, we can't care. I mean, basically life is like it used to be. Mum, dad, and 3 kids. And mum just stays at home all day baking cakes and doing her hair. So when dad gets home from work at 5:30 on the dot, she's all ready and the house is clean and the children are, that kind of environment. Or the brave new world, where everyone is concerned and the government's behind them. Or the bronze lifeguard, where we don't do much, but the public do it themselves. Now, if you kind of think about the health strategy under each of those 4 scenarios, they're completely different. On the one hand, we've got this high concern for public health. So really our strategy as a Department of Health needs to be to promote clean air, healthy food, healthy eating. On the other side, where people are unhealthy, we need to put more hospital beds in place and so on. So the investment strategy is significantly affected by the nature of the scenario that comes up. So the basic question that I've kind of posed is, how do you think scenario planning could work for you? And what are some of the alternative futures facing your organisation? So for the last time, I'm just going to ask you to turn to the person next door and just have a quick conversation about that. And then I'm going to sum up so we finish dead on time at 10 to 3 and your Norm doesn't kick my Norm's ass, okay? 1 minute. How could scenario planning work for you in your environment? And what are the alternative futures facing your organisation? All righty, we'll wind you up. Thank you. Okay. I'm not going to ask any of you for feedback. We don't really have time, and I don't want to delay your afternoon tea. But what I would like to do is maybe just finish up by summarising the key kind of points we made and the sort of key message that I guess I was trying to get over. So the first one is really that risk is an inevitable consequence of uncertainty. It's about the variability in the outcomes that this uncertain environment can dish up. And that uncertainty is, again, an inevitable consequence of complexity. But the beautiful thing, of course, is that innovation has that same profile. And so uncertainty, I mean, it's been said that if you can live and tolerate a high level of uncertainty in your environment, there are enormous opportunities that are open to you. So this is uncertainty that really promotes such a positive and it's such a good spawning ground for innovation. It is, in fact, the model that we use in innovation. Secondly, that if we accept and embrace this notion of uncertainty as we look to the future, then we are actually, embracing the notion of alternative futures. The fact that as a society, as a community, as a sector, and our individual agencies, and even as individuals, we don't face a future. We face a range of futures. And our role in that is significant. We can actually shape the future. And I think one of the things we've learned from the early 60s when scenario planning was really developed at Royal Dutch Shell is it was initially developed as a way of planning for contingencies. So if this happens, what will we do? If that happens, what will we do? If the oil price spikes, how will we respond? And that was the kind of genesis of scenario planning. But we've since realized that scenario planning is in fact a very powerful change tool. And if we can mobilize significant amounts and proportions of the community and tell the stories of these alternative futures, and I lived through that in South Africa. I mean, South Africa's future was changed by the Anglo-American Royal Dutch Shell scenarios, the 4 stories we told about South Africa's future. During the apartheid years, there were 4 stories. There was the notion of the ostrich, which, as some of you would know, traditionally has its head in the sand, and because it can't see anyone, it believes that no one can see it. So we were going to hide, and we were going to look further afield to recruit rebel rugby teams and cricket teams. We would make it without them. Okay? The first time I ever came to New Zealand, and I still had my South African passport, this is no lie, I had to sign a letter, the High Commission in Canberra, stating that I wasn't coming to New Zealand to recruit a rebel rugby team or cricket team. It's amazing. But so we had the ostrich, we had the lame duck, which is that we'll make some kind of concessions, but not the real ones. And the lame duck, again, as the term implies, wouldn't really make too much of a difference. The third scenario was one which was called Icarus. And Icarus is really where we were going to nationalize all the industries, give the mines back to the people, and everyone would be filled with euphoria, foreign investment would flood into the country, and like Icarus, we would fly to the, to the stars. But then, of course, like Icarus, the heat of the sun would melt the wax and the feathers would fall off, and we'd crash and burn. And the fourth scenario was the flight of the Flamingos, which is about the story about how we'd rebuild the institutions and the society and rebalance the inequality. And that was the single scenario that actually brought the ANC on the left-hand side and the nationalist government on the right-hand side to actually see the world in the same way. The ANC actually changed the economic manifesto when they actually understood that scenario. So stories have a powerful impact on the way people's mindsets work and the way they look at the future. So embracing the future and understand alternative futures. And to recognize that resilience is in fact building capability across these alternative futures. And the wider the range of these futures, the more potential you have for surviving any eventuality, i.e. you get more resilient. Resilience is a function of situational awareness, scanning the environment, organizational agility, which comes from your network capabilities and decentralization, clear purpose, which has towards messaging, strong governance with diverse stakeholders, and the use of scenarios to tell stories about alternative futures. Those are the elements that our work suggests build strong resilience. And finally, scenario planning is really the study of the future that really allows us to embrace alternative futures and to enhance our resilience. That's pretty much all I've got time for today, so thank you very much, and I hope the rest of your conference is very, very successful. Thank you.
Thank you, Norm. For me, that's really thought-provoking, but also brings a whole lot of re-emphasis around some of the conversations that I think we, as a group of stakeholders, have been having for some time. And I'm hoping that you can all see what this could mean for you individually and how you think about this stuff, but also what it means for your organisations too. You know, part of the challenge we have is, are we prepared to be ambitious and step up and step into the uncertainty? I think we are. But it's about you stepping forward at the same time, and it might mean, and some of you may have heard me use the term before, a need for us to collectively wallow in a level of discomfort that we're not used to. But actually from that, what we might get is a whole lot of other options that aren't yet visible to us, but a whole lot of other options that might demonstrate some innovation, demonstrate a way forward for us that we haven't contemplated, and ensure we're better placed to provide support to New Zealand. So I'm hoping that for you, that this presentation has provided some of that thought context, but also I'm challenging you to step forward with us as a team into that space of uncertainty and think about the future in a different way. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.